Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Imagery segment. Today, I'm with the CEO of Arterys, John. John, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
To give the audience a little, again, context of how we got to this conversation, we looked at well over 240 imagery startups or startups within what we call the imagery category. We thought Arterys was one of the top companies within the space. We think that they're part of the general imagery solutions that exist within this ecosystem. And we're excited about the products that they've built, the functionality, and some of the cool features that they've added on top of their platform. And so we're going to get into that today. But to start, John, I think it would be great if we started with that live product demo that you have, and then we'll start from there. Yeah?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So let me just share my screen, and just to give a quick introduction as to what Arterys does is really Arterys is a medical imaging AI platform that kind of allowing you to weave AI clinical applications directly into your cockpit, into whatever you're using today, whether it's PACS, EHR, and really make it a natural extension of what physicians are already doing. So with that, what I'll do is just hit share and present. And what I want to do is start off with just kind of an overview of the different solutions we have. So I don't know if you can see my screen. Can you see it now?
I can see your screen. Yeah.
Perfect. So if you on our website, we kind of have what we call our marketplace, which is essentially a storefront of all the clinical applications that we currently offer. And Arterys is, as I mentioned, kind of a portfolio of different solutions targeted for specific service lines that are solving a specific need. So with that, I kind of want to highlight a few of these what I call kind of our premium applications in AI, and that kind of cover a few different segments. So the first is that I want to highlight just a very basic workflow is chest MSK X-ray. So all of you can go and try this now in your browser. We've actually just activated this functionality so that no matter where you are in the world, you can really interact live with our products. So here, what you can see is our native viewer. And in this case, what's happening is an X-ray is being routed automatically from the hospital to the cloud, and we will automatically detect 7 pathologies between MSK and chest X-rays. So in this case, a fracture has been found, and you can you have all the tools of a basic viewer, window levels, going through different series, zooming and panning. So this particular product is targeted to ED physicians, primarily for the European market, that essentially allows them to quickly assess what's going on in a chest or MSK X-ray image, and from there, provide care faster. And this can be done 24/7. So they don't have to wait for the radiologist to actually confirm, because most of the X-rays aren't being read today. So by empowering these frontline ED physicians with this information, that they can provide care or potentially discharge the patient sooner. So that's just one example of how we're leveraging our X-ray product. So this is our lung product. So same interface, but what we're able to do now is this is specifically targeting lung nodules. So what I'm going to do is kind of show you at a high level what this product does, which is primarily looking at identifying and quantifying lung nodules in patients, and longitudinally tracking these nodules over time and reporting that for kind of cancer follow-up. So in this case, the software will automatically pull all the prior exams for that patient and compare that with the current exams. And so here, what I'll do is I'll kind of pan out here so you can see the full chest. And here you're just seeing this on my laptop, but in a real environment, you would be looking at a large screen that's kind of typically in a radiologist cockpit. So here I can scroll through, and we're highlighting all the lung nodules this patient has, which has several, and the time it would take to just segment or localize these and determine the volume of these to see if there's any progression would be impossible, because it's just nobody would spend the time. So what we're able to do is really assess the changes in size, as well as identify like what certain lung rad score depending on what the makeup of that nodule in terms of density, in terms of location, and so on. So I can also just quickly show a comparison here, which shows you kind of across time what it looks like in terms of volume or linear measurement or the volume doubling time and so on. So this is just our kind of interactive lung nodule workflow. And just lastly, I wanted to highlight our cardiac workflow here. So you can click on Cardio AI, and same sort of thing. You can click on specific sample studies here. So once I do that, it'll load right into this sample study. And what we did this for is to allow anybody in the world to actually play with the software and upload their own data, because we don't want to wait for people to have it installed to actually try and interact with it live. So what I'm going to show you here is our what I call our 4D Flow product, which is essentially a way to be able to visualize and quantify blood flow non-invasively using MRI. So Arterys was the pioneer in this space and commercialized this initially with GE Healthcare. And what you're seeing here is the color represents blood speed, red being high and blue being low. And essentially through this web browser, you can interact with the full 3D image and be able to quantify exactly how much flow is going through a region of interest. So this is important for patients with structural heart disease and patients who have valvular disease, and it's assessing, for example, regurgitation of the mitral valve or aortic valve that is more accurate than your standard echo exam. So this is more for function and flow, and of course we have additional modules for kind of our conventional cardiac MRI, where we leverage AI to automatically contour the ventricles of the heart. So in this case, we have over 8 machine learning algorithms that are working seamlessly to create this workflow for you. So in this case, I can when a user goes in, automatically the volumes of the heart are segmented, and you can very easily assess what the stroke volume and ejection fraction is of a patient's heart. And it's all you can interact with these images. You can modify the contours if you want to, and of course there's a whole reporting segment where you can push these results into dictation and or the EMR. So at a high level, backing out again, it's really Arterys is a kind of a platform to host all AI solutions across the board, and has built kind of a viewer and a backend platform to just seamlessly take that data, de-identify it, send it to the cloud and back, to really kind of enhance the existing workflow with AI. So I hope that was helpful.
Wow, that was really helpful. When did you add the functionality that you can actually look into the specific algorithms? Yeah,
within the last few weeks, and we actually update once every 3 to 4 days. So that's a very, very different paradigm compared to all your conventional PACS companies that update yearly at best, right? So with Arterys, you just refresh your browser and you have the latest and greatest. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I didn't see that the last time I looked at your website, so that's really cool. Yeah. I want to talk about some of those specifics, features that you talked about, the different tools that you have. But before I even get into that, I'm curious, what's the backstory behind this company? Why did you start this company?
Sure. So the backstory was that one of my co-founders, Fabian, came to me while I was working on my PhD, and he had sleep apnea, and his doctor told him that he had to do a crazy invasive procedure, and there was a 30% chance of success of this procedure, and it just wasn't good enough for him. And so he said, this is crazy, back in 2010, that we don't have the technology to really have more accuracy or more better tools to really identify if a certain care is going to be successful or not. So he came to me. I was doing my PhD in computational fluid dynamics, and that's kind of where it started, of him and I looking and seeing where we can leverage data and leverage all the computing power that I had been used to in medicine. And so through this discovery, we met with two other co-founders who were radiologists at the time, and we realized that there was a potential here to start with a specific application in cardiac MR, which is 4D flow, which I brought the technical side and the compute side. Fabian brought the business side, and then our two other co-founders brought the medical and clinical side. So there was kind of that was the impetus, is it kind of creating a platform to just for data-driven medicine ultimately. And we knew we couldn't create just a generic platform initially. We had to start somewhere, and we've been fortunate enough to have the funding and have the experience to say, we're going to start with one application, and we've broadened that to where we are today, to really being a platform play. Yeah.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, and with that, was the cardiovascular AI assist tool the first tool that you guys worked on?
It was initially, when we started, it wasn't AI. It was just 4D flow, which because this was back in 2012. AI started in 2015 in medical imaging. So
gotcha.
we started it. We jumped on that bandwagon in 2015, and we were the first ones to get FDA clearance for a machine learning algorithm that's hosted in the cloud, actually. And since then, we've obviously invested a ton of energy and effort to actually commercialize these, and it's been challenging because AI by itself is a tool. What's really important is making it work seamlessly in that native cockpit, whatever that cockpit is. For a frontline physician, it could be a mobile phone, it could be a pager message, it could be a full 6-screen radiology work cockpit, right? So AI by itself is just again, it's just one tool in the arsenal that needs to be integrated in the right way. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's focus on the three, I would say, major tools or three offerings that you have within your platform, and then we'll kind of get into the marketplace. So the AI assist for the cardiovascular patients, you have lots of cool features. This is everything from the 4D flow that you talked about. You have this semi-quantitative perfusion, which is another means of quantifying flow, from my understanding.
Sure.
You have automatic contours. You have repeatable flow quantification. Can you provide more context on what these features are and why they're important, and how do they actually change provider workflows?
Sure. So to start off, just to give you a sense of kind of cardiovascular MRI in general, is that it's today a fairly small market because it's just not being used, and there's a whole different reasons why. But the reality is there is a need to be able to leverage MR to basically quantify several parts of the heart. For example, one is in essentially tissue characterization, to identify patients who have had a heart attack, and to assess what is the level of damage or occlusion or whatever you're trying to measure. And MR does a pretty good job at that, assessing like to your point, perfusion or how much blood is going through a specific tissue, assessing for example, there's other ways to do that through like delayed enhancements. So you're essentially looking for scar. There's other techniques like T1 mapping, T2, which is essentially ways to measure iron overload and fibrosis. And so essentially ways to see whether the heart has gone through a traumatic event or not. In addition, so that's kind of one category, is around the tissue characterization. And the other where MR does really well is in the quantification of flow and function. So what's moving inside the heart, and that's a real need, that something that there's no other tool can do really well today. I mentioned echocardiography, and that is a strong tool for measuring structure, but it doesn't measure flow very well, and it doesn't measure tissue characterization quite well. So patients eventually will always get an echo, but a few patients get cardiac MR, and there needs to be software there that interprets those images. So that's where this niche started, and it's still a niche today. Is that you need software, like PACS today can't read these exams, so you need dedicated software to process and to quantify cardiac MR images and provide this information to the referring physician to say how to treat these patients. So that's where this need comes from, is more accurately identifying and progressing disease for patients who have some sort of cardiac abnormality. So that's kind of the reason why this segment exists, which is a little bit unique in the AI segment, because again, there's no other option. Like if you have a cardiac MR program, you need to have cardiac MR software. Versus with X-ray, you don't need to have AI X-ray software. Like somebody can just look at an image and just say, yeah, something exists. So that's why the companies like ours and a few others exist, is because to fill that specific need to process these images.
And so having this tool and this functionality is truly a big jump from what a lot of providers have been able to do in the past. Is you've been able to actually quantify things like we talked about, blood flow or structures of the heart, et cetera. And prior to that, by just looking at an MRI or an MR scan, it's just not possible, or it take a really long time and it's not going to be as accurate.
Correct. Yeah. Because again, you can look at an MR exam in PACS and guess kind of that the blood flow looks a little bit high based on like brightness in the image, or guess that the ventricle size has an ejection fraction of what X%, but it's not accurate, especially if you're trying to really triage patients to go to surgery or not. You'd ideally want to know exactly what the regurgitation is in that valve and see if it's progressing or getting worse or better. So that's where you need more dedicated tools to do that.
I see. That makes sense. How do you build something like this? Like, where does the data set come to train these algorithms to be able to quantify a lot of the things that you're measuring? Like, how did you build this functionality? And on top of that, are there limitations? Because I know, especially in these settings, if it's the wrong measurement, it could have serious consequences. And so I'm just curious about how this is built and how,
Sure. So one thing I'll mention is that we started with 4D Flow, which is an application for in MR that non-invasively measures blood flow. But in that case, the data sets were very large, on the order of gigabytes. That's something that PACS couldn't manage at the time. So we took a very specific decision back in 2012 that we were going to create a completely cloud-native infrastructure to process this data. And that came from the need that the PACS or local on-premise servers or GPUs couldn't do this in an efficient way, and the turnaround times in order to generate it. So there are other areas that I'm seeing that today, like for tomosynthesis, or for like 3D mammo or spectral CT, or just in general, imaging is getting larger and larger, and the amount of GPUs or CPUs required to process that data aren't there today. So we essentially created this cloud-native platform, which in essence became kind of Trojan horse for us, because that meant we were collecting all the data. And so when 2015 hit with AI, we had all this data just sitting there on our servers. And that's been unique to us, because we have this constant feedback loop of all the data funnels into our system, and we can provide great care for our users, because we know what they're doing, what's working, what's not working, and how we can help them improve. And then through the workflow, whether of them accepting, rejecting, or modifying, we then use that to retrain the algorithms, so we can get better over time. So that's kind of the idea of uniqueness of a kind of a cloud-based system versus selling a CD-ROM. If you sell a CD-ROM to a physician, like you're not going to learn anything from that. You're not moving the entire industry into data-driven medicine. Like that's our focus. That's our vision of leveraging the data that's out there to help improve patient care in the long term. So going back to your question, how do we do it? Is since we have this data there, we can create the models and then train the models, deploy them, and even deploy them at specific sites and see how they're doing, and then make them generally available for all of our sites. So we have that flexibility since we are kind of cloud-based. But again, a lot of the training can be done offline. The cloud is mostly for the production, like deployment of the software. But most of it is kind of, once you have the data, then you can download it and train, and then upload the model to the production system.
Cool. Let's move on to the next big segment, and it's almost probably very similar structure and setup in the way that you've approached AI Cyst for cardiovascular patients. But you have AI Cyst for chest CT analysis. Again, that does everything from nodule detection. You highlighted that earlier. You did longitudinal tracking. You have volumetric segmentation. Again, can you provide a little bit more context on some of the important features of this tool and why they're important?
Sure. So part of the challenge right now that specifically radiologists deal with chest CTs is that it is tedious to essentially to track lung nodules over time and being able to just to report on them, whether it's part of a lung cancer screening workflow or whether it's an incidental workflow or even kind of more kind of cancer follow-up cases. So it's just tedious to try to click, identify the nodule, and have that be segmented in 3D, because I think generally that's where the industry is going to be moving, because it's historically been 2D, which is a linear distance. But we know that that's not sufficient because there's all kinds of nodules that may look circular at the center, but as soon as you scroll up or down, it's a completely different shape, right? So moving into 3D analysis, I think, will become the norm over the next 5 years. And so knowing the volume is important, but trying to do that manually is not possible. It would just take way too much time. And additionally, trying to co-register these series and any prior exams that patients had, it just takes too long without a dedicated system for this. So if there's a way to longitudinally track these patients over time, and then also report on that using kind of existing standards like lung rads, RECIST, or Fleischner criteria, that's where you can create a lung product that is doing something that can save time, can be more accurate, more sensitive and specific than a ill-experienced radiologist, and can essentially help patients ultimately, right? Because if you can find a nodule early in stage 1 or stage 2 that potentially could have been missed without AI, that has huge repercussions, right, downstream. And it's happened. It's happened several times where radiologists will miss a small lung nodule, because they don't miss the big ones, but they miss the ones that are stage 1, stage 2, with 3 millimeter, 6 millimeter nodules that maybe maybe they missed it and they said, let's follow up in 2 years. But in that time, that nodule grew and eventually went to stage 3, stage 4 cancer, right? So there's been exactly cases like that, which have a dramatic clinical impact. So there's time savings, but there's also clinical, positive clinical impact that can help patients longer term. So that's kind of the intent of the lung product. And today the real challenge is integrating that natively into their existing workflow, specifically for radiologists. So we've fine-tuned exactly how to do that so that it's integrated into that view. So whether it's integrated into PACS natively, or whether it's a separate view on a different screen, or whether it's a string that gets published into the dictation, for example, automatically. That is, that's what our product can do, and it's customized per institution, because every institution has a different way, a different flavor of how they want to see things done.
I see. And for this particular tool, the method of training your models was it very similar to what you did with the way that you collected this data and then build out your platform? Is it almost the exact same way that you did with the AI Cyst for cardiovascular patients?
Yeah, it is, but there's a couple areas where it's a little bit different, because just for example, in the training data for cardiac, I think we had just maybe 5,000 cases or less of patients, because most patients have a heart. So at the end of the day, if you're, for example, segmenting the left endocardium, or the left ventricle, the endocardium of that, most patients have that. Versus in cancer, if you took 5,000 patients, most patients still don't have a lung nodule. So that's a little bit different in the training data, is to have like orders of magnitude more than our cardiac MR application, because you almost need 100,000 cases to have 1,000 cases that have a lung nodule, or that you have the representative based on sample based on your indications. Because, for example, like what's the certain size of lung nodule that the AI is tracking, what the different densities of these lung nodules are, patient age. Those are all things that need to be represented in the training data and in the test and validation data. And so if it's very broad, you need to have many more samples.
Okay, that makes sense. And for the final tool, you have this AI Cyst for emergency department X-rays.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's diagnostic assistance. You have a short example of what that looked like earlier. That includes a workflow as well, and then a couple other set features. But why emergency departments for it specifically? And can you talk about some of the important features of this tool as well?
Sure. So radiologists, I would say aren't the user of this tool, and I'll tell you why. Radiologists can look at an X-ray and can do much better than AI at an experienced radiologist at detecting what's happening in this image. And so if you're trying to augment with AI something that radiologists do really, really well today, and very fast, it's a much higher barrier to entry. So places where you're seeing more adoption of AI is in areas where potentially radiologists aren't involved, or it's not about making them 2 seconds faster on an exam. It's more about if you can really provide something new that hasn't been done before. In the case of the cardiac MR, they weren't able to do 40 flow before, so we offer them a whole new tool to be able to measure blood flow. So with X-ray, there's a specific problem happening in Europe where X-rays aren't read, especially in the ED departments. They're not read because the volumes are too high, and there's just not enough radiologists to read them. Not only at night, so of course the issue is exacerbated, off hours, but even during the day, these exams aren't being read. So you have patients in the ED that could have been discharged hours earlier, or essentially could have been prescribed treatment much faster than that ED physician looking at that X-ray and being a little bit uncertain, and then having to call the radiologist, say, hey, like I don't know how to read this. Like, what do you think? It's just not efficient. So what our chest X-ray product does, and MSK X-ray product, is that it allows that ED physician to be empowered to give them the same level of knowledge as a kind of a mid-junior level radiologist. And the reason I say mid-junior level is because AI will never be as good as a experienced radiologist. But if we can at least bring the level of knowledge up for non-radiologists up to that kind of mid-level, then that will be sufficient for them to say, I'm going to let this patient go, or if this patient has a pleural effusion, or has a dislocation, or has some fracture, whatever is in the X-ray exam, it can be speed up the whole process of treatment. So that there's a specific need for that in Europe for frontline physicians, and I would say that need is different than in the U.S. And in the U.S., it's almost all X-rays get read. Maybe not in a maybe the turnaround times are long, but and eventually that product could be brought into the U.S. market, but the value prop isn't as high as it is in Europe.
Interesting. And I think you kind of touched on how these, in a couple different ways, how these three tools have really changed the workflow of providers. In this case, emergency departments, they weren't reading X-rays before. Now they can look at the analysis and make an informed decision based on that. In the other cases where we talked about the your AI assist tools for cardiology, you're building out a whole new functionality that cardiologists didn't have before that they can use as a tool set to now do any types of procedures or carry on with their diagnosis. Is there any other, and I just curious, is there anything else that you've seen with tools that providers weren't able to do before, but now they have the ability to do so, using the functionalities in these 3 specific tools?
So I would say, within our 3 tools, we have. I would say no. I mean, the reality is that we've had to spend a lot of time thinking about the exact use cases and making it like very specific to them. Now, are they using it to do other things potentially in research settings? But that doesn't happen. Honestly, it's like you create a tool specific to solve a specific problem, and they use it that way. Now, if you're creating generic tools, like for example, like a generic viewer or a research packs or things like that, then for sure people are creative in terms of how it's being used and whether it's used at home and so on. But at least if you're targeting our specific clinical applications or indications, the intention is that they use them to solve that specific problem. But I will say that I have seen other areas, to your point, of creating just certain tools that are used off label and that are used to solve other issues. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Now I wanted to kind of shift gears into this marketplace, because this is crazy comparison to most other imagery style companies. Well, first, even before you get into that, you've expanded your portfolio, not just to focus on one category. You're doing multiple. First, why did you decide to expand out to offering functionality for multiple? I mean, cardiology, you have X-rays, now you have CT scans. Why did you expand?
Sure. So when we started with just one application, the feedback that we received is that a lot of providers just want to work with one vendor, and ideally that vendor has a broad set of applications that they can serve, and just it's a lot of headache from IT, from integration, from contracting, from whatever it is to work with 50 vendors. So if we had a cardiac application and maybe an ultrasound application or a CT application, it would be kind of hit 2-3 birds with one stone, right? So there is value in having a single vendor that can have a broad set of clinical applications that work seamlessly within that cockpit. And so we made a concerted effort to say, you know what, we're going to work with our partners that are out there creating machine learning algorithms and vendors that are creating applications, and have them seamlessly integrated into our cloud native platform, such that we can offer a broader set of applications. So that's been the strategy, is that we essentially have an open innovation platform, a way that anybody in the world can deploy their machine learning into a clinical environment, which today is very challenging from an IT perspective, from a vendor credentialing perspective, from a security privacy review perspective. So if we've already done that with a specific hospital, now that these third-party producers can come onto our platform, and we can upsell these providers with much more content. So that's the strategy, and of course we're still focused on solving specific needs. It's not like we have an e-catalog of 50,000 tiles and we're just hoping and praying that one of them will start selling. We still have to be very specific in targeting tiles that are useful and that essentially have some sort of ROI story around them, right? Because ultimately, if it's not reimbursed, if it's not solving a productivity issue, it's not providing immense clinical value, then why is it even being offered, right? So so today, I don't know. I quickly showed you the just to quickly let me show you the marketplaces that we do have several partners already that have come on board, and we have close to 40 tiles today that cover primarily COVID-19 specific kind of pathology, because that's what was our early beta release just back in March. And so a lot of these algorithms were created by third-party producers that are now live and that we've now deployed at in our install base. So that are already making difference at detecting pneumonia and other COVID-19 associated pathology. And of course, there's many more. There's neuro applications, there's breast applications, and so on. So it's been a fantastic ride, honestly. It's just that we're learning a lot, and I think this is just the beginning, is having the ability to aggregate all of these AI solutions into a single workflow, and in certain cases, a single application. Because when you think of it, for our lung CT product, we can combine lung nodule detection with a COVID-19 detection, with nodule malignancy classification. So like all of that can be seamlessly integrated into our right panel, which makes it like an augmented workflow. And it's not 3 different applications. It's truly a single application that has that functionality of several machine learning models. So that experience of being cloud native and the kind of augmenting a single workflow with multiple producers is novel, and that nobody's doing that. When you look at all the marketplaces out there, they're selling point solutions as single tiles. But for us, it's all integrated and seamlessly as part of a single workflow.
Yeah, that was one of the most unique things, I think, especially which is also why we wanted to talk with you and highlight you as one of the top companies in the space, is the marketplace that you built. And I'm curious, what is that relationship that you guys have built with, these third-party vendors or developers, and how do they benefit in working directly with you? I know you already highlighted a little bit, but I'm just want to reiterate that.
Sure. So it's a few different reasons. One is obviously that we're a channel distributor for them. So we have our, a pretty large install base in Europe and in US. That's where our focus is. And so for a lot of these vendors that potentially don't have that install base, we immediately become a channel for them, where we can go in and upsell to our existing customers, but also we're actively adding more and more customers. 2 is we know that machine learning, honestly, is about 5% of the problem. You still have to work on the other 95% to actually make it a clinical application that has clinical evidence and that is reimbursed, right? So there's like ML and machine learning in the training is really just the tip of the iceberg. You need to make that be seamlessly integrated into that cockpit and have evidence that it's actually working and making an impact on ROI, and ultimately hopefully get reimbursement. But out of the 250 companies you mentioned, only 3 have gotten it so far. Like I would argue HeartFlow has, I would argue IDX has, and I would argue Viz has. And it's just 3 out of hundreds. Now it's still early in the game, but more will be coming. But I think that's what's that's what's exciting, is that it's honestly a greenfield, and yeah, it's but by having the marketplace that allows to just take all that in and make it feel as if it's one vendor is unique, and so that this vendor doesn't have to work with trying to do IT installs or sign EULAs or BAAs with hospitals. Like it just accelerates their time to market, essentially, from a year and a half down to potentially a couple months before they start seeing revenue. There's more benefits other than channel and time to market, but it's also marketing channels and so on. So that's the intention, is that we focus on the last mile and they focus on the machine learning, and we work well together to kind of create a 1 + 1 = 3 solution.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, I'm curious now on the implementation. How does this work? Where does the provider push the MR CT scans, and how are they uploaded? And you talked about everything's kind of in the cloud. How do you, what kind of dashboards are they using? You gave a couple different examples, and it could be a variety of different cockpits, but how do they actually access it? Are they just going to a website? And can you take me through the implementation process, and how much, I know I'm throwing onboarding with questions, and how much hand-holding goes into this as well?
Sure. So to start off is we really pride ourselves on a completely serverless infrastructure, where in a way we do deployments now where there's no virtual machines at all on site. It's completely serverless, and all we really need is a internet connection out to our kind of private cloud, right? So, and that we can do through VPN or through kind of HTTPS connections and so on. But at the end of the day, the images are routed from either the modalities or from PACS or DICOM routed through existing DICOM routers to our what we refer to as our edge service. It's kind of a piece of software that essentially is a DICOM router that routes the images to the right place. So that this edge service can be in our cloud, it can be on-prem if they want it, and it also allows for de-identification of the images so that no PHI is sent to the cloud at all. And from there, once the images arrive up into the cloud, they're triaged to the right machine learning algorithms and processing servers. And then depending on the workflow, either automatic results are pushed back into the hospital or pushed into our viewer. So it kind of depends on the workflow. Some workflows, there is no viewer, which just sends results automatically to dictation. Other workflows for lung or cardiac, as I showed you, there's actually a viewer there. And then, so that's kind of how the images are kind of pre-routed. And then from there, physicians log in from wherever they are. It kind of depends on the cockpit, but let's say for cardiac MR, that they'll launch it from their native work list. So we do URL launching, where it launches in context with that patient from the EMR-driven workflow or the risk-driven workflow or PACS-driven workflow. And then from there, they interact and visualize the results. And then with a single click, the results are pushed back into dictation or the EMR. So it's kind of a very low footprint way just to have immense functionality and essentially like infinite compute to process these images and to send the results in a very timely fashion back to where they need to be. And we really pride ourselves on the turnaround time, of how long it takes to send the data out, process, and send the data back. And we can do that in the order of just a few seconds with X-ray. With CT, it can be done in a couple minutes or less. With large MRs, it can be done in like 5-10 minutes. It depends on the bandwidth a little bit or the constraint there, but overall, it's a very efficient way to get the right data to the right place with quick turnaround times. So that's kind of how it works behind the scenes.
Awesome. Why, it seems also in one sense a competitive advantage to have such a simple implementation.
Yeah.
And this is, especially when it comes to images and managing this, it sometimes can be just an absolute mess.
I mean, I'll give you one example. I won't name the health system, but there's one PACS company. I won't name the PACS company. It's a very modern PACS company. And if you were to guess how many people hours it took them to upgrade from version 22 to version 22.1, so a minor release. If you were to guess the number of people hours involved just to upgrade their PACS workstations with the newest software, how many hours do you think it took?
I don't know.
It's thousands of hours.
Oh my God.
So can you imagine taking thousands of hours? We're taking literally 0 hours because we do it for you. Like we handle all the upgrades centrally. And for a hospital, just to refresh the browser and get the latest software with 0 hours of work, it's pretty attractive.
Wow. Yeah. And especially with having one central location for accessing multiple different tools,
Yeah.
I'm curious on, especially with the emergence of AI assisted tools for imagery. How involved is your software in getting to performing, for example, things like a diagnosis or guiding providers what they should be doing, versus how much of it is just, here's the measurements, this is everything you need to know, you make the decision on your own? How do you balance that? What do your providers prefer? What is the sweet spot for you guys?
Sure. So that really ultimately comes down to how it's marketed and how it's regulated. So everything we've done has kind of been as a class 2 medical device, which essentially provides support to the physician that will actually ultimately be providing that diagnosis. We don't provide a diagnosis. That's more kind of a class 3 higher risk medical device. There's a few other companies out of the 200 that have actually gotten regulatory clearance to provide a diagnosis. One is IDX, they mentioned, that like has essentially can rule out or can essentially say that a patient is normal, I believe. But ultimately, it's few and far between, and so we're really starting from more of a basis of quantification and simple like segmentation, classification, detection, sorts of tasks that work really well with medical imaging, and providing that report in a way that can be consumed quickly. So it saves time overall and improves consistency across readers and improves in accuracy ultimately, right? So I would say that's kind of our sweet spot. But ultimately, we're also dependent on how the market evolves in this space. Like as more Class 3 devices come on board, we'd be happy to host them and be part of this ecosystem that we're building, right? But there's few and far between because it's a hard thing to do. It's hard to provide a diagnosis because, as I mentioned in X-ray, for example, you could be looking for 1,000 different things, and right now we detect 7 of the 1,000. So for algorithms that will say, oh, this is a normal X-ray, that won't happen for many years because you need to rule out 1,000+ things, and that's really hard to do because you need to have the training data to do that. So that's why right now you have algorithms that can rule out a handful of things or even 20 things, but it's hard to provide a diagnosis with AI.
Okay, and kind of going off that point, you mentioned that you guys have, I think, 7 FDA clearances.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what those are and why they're important, why you went this route?
Sure. So essentially, our first 4 were really targeted toward cardiovascular MRI, and recently we've been focusing on kind of getting the entire platform approved or cleared. So what that means is that all the tools that we're building are kind of generic tools that work across multiple different workflows, so that they work for X-ray, CT, MR, and from there, that's kind of the strategy we've taken at kind of clearing our MICA. That's the name of our platform, and MICA has multiple applications that are part of it. But again, it's a single kind of clearance for all of that. And so every year or so, we'll update our entire platform with a new submission based on new functionality that we add. That's mostly generic functionality like 3D rendering or viewing mammo images or being able to view additional types of modalities, so those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, to be a platform, you still need to be generic to be able to process any sort of images and report and analyze them. And so like that's what fundamentally our platform does.
So one of the things that I realized for a lot of healthcare software companies is that it's really long sales cycles. Working with providers is tough. Integrating with EHR systems is tough. How did you manage this? How did you push through? And how do you work through these big barriers? Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you, and I haven't heard a great answer from any vendor, no matter how successful they've been. It's a grind. It's horrible. It's just like you're constantly pushing, constantly calling. You're going on site. Pre-COVID, you're doing everything you can just to try to connect with somebody in IT. To just spend 1 hour to do a little bit of work that may take 9 months to get scheduled. And the reason why it takes 9 months to get scheduled is because they don't work kind of as in a way where they're always trying to provide incremental value. It's like they have 100 things to do, and they're going to pick the one that provides the most amount of value for the shortest amount of time. It's like the way they prioritize is who knows how it's done. It's crazy. And so I'll give you some examples. Epic. If there's a big Epic upgrade, Epic will take all IT resources, and you're going to be in the queue until that's done, which could take years. So at the end of the day, it's like again, I have no great answer. It's horrendous, and it just takes a lot of time. Yeah. And we try to make things seamless, and we try to make things so that when the work gets done, it takes less than 20 minutes to actually integrate. So yes, but at the end of the day, that's not the problem. The 20 minutes is not the problem. It's the year that's the problem.
Mm. Well, I'm curious, kind of building off that question. What are some examples of these deliverables that you're pitching to these providers, and what do you think resonates the most with them?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on who you're pitching to. If you're pitching to the end user, so I'll give you, for example, like a radiologist, there you're pitching about productivity, about the time savings to actually process a specific exam. You're pitching new functionality that allows them to do things they weren't able to do before. So that's more on the clinical benefits and outcome side. If you're pitching a CIO or person in charge of IT, there you're pitching more like more cost savings. So say you don't have to maintain expensive servers or GPUs or GPU clusters. You don't need the people power to actually to just be on call and ready to fix anything that's happening, because that's what our service does. Like we have people on staff that ensures that it's running 24/7 and that upgrades are handled by us, right? So there's a cost savings and it's just running the system and storing the images, things like that. And then if you're targeting more like the CFO or more of the folks that have the purse strings, then it's more of a ROI calculation of showing that if you can reduce this amount of time, then like this is the opportunity cost, and this is how much could potentially be saved with that. As an example, if it's time savings, or if it's about trying to there's a couple of other companies that have shown the potential of reducing the amount of time it takes to intervention if you have a stroke, for example. So there it's more of an ROI story to prove how much this can save me, or if there is a reimbursement code or not. So it kind of depends on the stakeholder, but ultimately it comes down to the clinical user, primarily for the applications that we've historically been selling.
Okay, and kind of building off that question, what does the business model look like? I mean, you have a unique model, and you also have a unique marketplace where you're working with third parties. Is everything kind of a subscription or a SaaS model? How does this work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's kind of we have yearly pricing based on certain volumes that they're doing, because it's essentially tied to the costs that we have. Since we're hosting all the hardware, and the maintenance support, as well as the cost of the processing and the viewing the images, storing and so on, all that is on our end. So we have ongoing costs, and so the SaaS model works well to kind of cover our ongoing costs versus historically selling a CD-ROM at a certain price that they buy the CD-ROM forever. That I'm seeing things are shifting away from that, right? So so that works quite well, and we don't really have a pushback on this yearly pricing, and which you can buy for multiple years if you have the budget for it. So that's a strategy, and that works well whether it's our own applications or third-party applications. Now that there could be nuances of this, basically to have a throttle on certain number of users or certain number of logins or things like that. But typically what we do is based on volume of number of exams per year. Yeah. Okay,
that makes sense. And this is more of a question as a venture investor, just because we're curious. And you talked about earlier that the products that you're building typically they're built for a very specific use case. How do you vision a market size for specific imagery services? Like, how big are we talking here? Actually? Sure. I mean, you talk about what you're in both Europe and America, and so I'm just curious.
Yeah. So there's been actually several different companies that have published recently on what the size of this market is, at least in AI-assisted software. But you could argue that the size is kind of maybe 400 million today, and maybe a little bit less than that. So it is quite small, but projected to grow to about 1.5 billion over the next 2 years. So it has quite a very high kind of just potential. And this is just for like AI assisted software. There's a whole different areas of where, for example, companion diagnostics, of having imaging be connected to the treatment, that opens up many different potential market opportunities for pharma, for med device, and so on. That is even untapped from there. So so that's kind of what people think of as kind of the marketplace, or the AI marketplace. But I do feel like it is just kind of scratching the surface of what can be done. And I'll give you an example. There's software today that measures dosage in terms of ionizing radiation or contrast injected in patients. and that's a several $100 million industry. And just to measure, how much dose a patient has. It's for a fairly basic piece of software, but it's several hundreds of millions of dollars for one clinical application. And that's because that's just been around and that market is fairly mature, but we're just scratching the surface. So like there's so much to be done to help augment physicians with AI. That's, again, the market, I would argue, over the next 10 years, it will be much more than even $2 billion.
Well, especially the marketplace that you're integrating and being able to build a lot of channel partners into your marketplace and quickly launch. It scales up quite quickly, I think. Where do you think the future of imagery services are going? And what do you see that most people don't?
Yeah, I would say, actually because of COVID, but it's really accelerating, is that this kind of digital transformation is happening. And, it was happening before COVID, but now I would say even more than before of folks seeing that there is a need to basically have consolidated, reading of exams, whether it's like teleradiology or on on premises, but the idea that you can consolidate to have reading groups that cover multiple different hospitals. I am seeing that trend. I'm seeing the trend of leveraging the cloud. Of course, AI is very early, but I am seeing the pockets of solutions that are solving specific needs that are being paid for. So I would say that the future for me, it looks like a place where the PACS of today won't be the PACS of tomorrow. I see that the really symbiosis between having a kind of a cockpit that's driven by intelligence, not necessarily by AI. AI is a buzzword, but really a much more efficient way to look at images, process them, read them, and provide the best care possible for everybody, not just radiologists, but anybody who's interacting with medical images. So I see this future where AI and PACS and dictation will kind of meld into one, and it's going to be an interesting space because you have these legacy vendors that won't be able to keep up. So you're going to have consolidation. You're going to have acquisition of companies to really help drive these larger monoliths into adopting these new technologies. So that's my kind of future forecast or prediction.
Oh, very interesting. Well, in kind of building off the beginning of that question, I keep saying I'm building off of every question. So very, but you talk about the pandemic a little bit. Has the pandemic affected you and your business, and how have you guys adjusted, or even in general, how has the imagery services adjusted for the recent pandemic?
Sure, I would argue that the volumes have definitely come down, or they were down. They're starting to come back up, but it's still much lower than what it was last year. So volumes are coming down, which means in outpatient imaging, they've been hit hard. Like any outpatient imaging services are getting less revenue. So what's that impacting for us? It hasn't really impacted kind of our install base. It's mostly in kind of when they pay. We're just seeing delays in payments generally. But also, yes, there's a slowdown for sure in adopting AI. So most of that cash is not being budgeted for AI solutions. So I think there will be a longer term effect next year, arguably, over because of COVID. So for us, we just have to ensure that we have the capital and we have the specific centers of excellence that we work with to prove out that the AI is being adopted and that there's clinical value there, and prove the clinical evidence and papers. As opposed to showing commercial traction because we want to be able to prove that it works before we try to bring 50 more salespeople out in the field when hospitals still don't have the budgets for it. So I think first comes the clinical evidence, then really comes the commercial acceleration. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, John, that was all the questions that I wanted to run through. This was fantastic. I really liked that you jumped and gave us some deep dives and actually how the product worked. The product visuals at the beginning, that was awesome. Thank you so much for doing the live demo.
Sure.
with that, before I close out, did you have any closing remarks that you wanted to make, or is there anything that you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, no, I really appreciated your time and your questions, and very insightful, which I appreciate you knowing a lot about the space, or knowing enough to be dangerous, which is it helps to keeps the conversation engaging. So thanks so much for your time.
Great. Well, thanks, Sean. And for the audience, again, this was one of the best companies that we thought within the imagery category, Arterys. And you can definitely check it out now, because you have on your website, you can actually do live. You don't even have to sign up, right? You could just immediately look at how the product works, and that's fantastic. So definitely check it out. John, thank you again so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.